Okay, I'm going to talk a little bit about silage management, and I was busily fixing my my presentation as Ev was talking there because I was trying to redirect some of my slides to answer some of the questions that were coming up, etc. So we'll see some of it as we go through. But obviously, I'm not going to talk a lot about the hybrid since Ev talked about that, but we will talk about optimal harvest, processing, some silage management, rollover inoculants, feed-out management, and some considerations about this, okay? So the first thing that I want to talk about is that we need to just go back to Silage and Forage 101 and talk about what is a high-quality silage, or what is a high-quality forage. And for me, that forage or silage should be high in nutrients, okay, energy, protein, or starch, or whatever your target is, but it needs to be digestible, and that's a really big key that we got to remember. You know, the old agronomy days, everybody was just looking for tonnage, and tonnage is good, but you got to have a compromise, right, between tonnage and quality. So high quality material, you know, alfalfa sprouts in the grocery store, 100% digestible, yield 0, right, or almost 0. So you've got to have a compromise, and of course that forage and silage has to have good effective fiber so that cows can chew and we can get that saliva produced. So with that, I want to really focus on the fact that, you know, there are two places where forage quality and silage quality are really controlled at, and they are, one, at the maturity at harvest, when we look at NDFD or starch digestibility or any kind of digestible component of that crop, and then what do we do with that crop after it's harvested, with the management, storage, and feed out. So we're going to talk about these things and how they actually interact today. All right. So I've been showing this slide for I don't know how many years. I mean, I go back to some of my old slides, and I won't even tell you how old they are, where I have this slide, and it's a great slide, I think, because it basically brings home the interrelationship between what can happen with what you do at harvest and what you do after harvest, okay? So I'm going to show you 4 different scenarios there. And so the first scenario is that we start with poor quality forage in the field. So don't ask why, okay? So the hurricane came through, or got, you know, the birds went through it, we got hail damage, the crop sat in the field for 10 days and got rained on 3 times. But let's just say when you go out into the field, what you're going to bring in the next 5 minutes is poor quality, okay? If you follow that with bad silo management, the obvious thing that you have at the end of the day for the rest of the year coming out of that silo is poor quality silage. So that's a no-brainer. Second scenario, we start with poor quality silage, forage from the field, but you're the best silo manager. So you use all the things that we're going to talk about in a second. You pack, you use silo stop, you use gravel bags, you have a face shaver, you have an inoculant. However, unfortunately, you're still going to end up with poor quality silage, okay? The worst case scenario, obviously, is that you start with high quality forage coming out of the field, blow it up in the silo, and you end up with, again, poor quality silage. So, you know, these scenarios are sort of no-brainers, but people really got to think about this because there's 2 places that we have some control, right? What we do at harvest and what we do in the silos. And so really what we want to do is encourage people to make sure that they bring in the highest quality forage from the field as possible, again, realizing that there's that compromise between yield and quality. Follow that by the best silo management they can possibly have so that we have high quality silage most of the time. Now, you know, even I can't get this to be 100% of the time because I don't control everything. And if you look at these 2 control points here, what's coming in from the field, and then the second point is what do you do in the silo, where do you have the least and where do you have the most control? Well, I think for the most part, we probably have the least control here, right, because of Mother Nature, right? I mean, we have some control because we have targets of when to harvest. I've talked about dry matter. You know, if you're looking at alfalfa, you're doing growing degree days, or you're looking at, you know, you're using a peak stick or whatever you're doing, but you have some targets, but Mother Nature is always fighting us. Well, what about here in silo management? I'm going to tell you that is where you typically should have, okay, and I say should have because there's that caveat about, you know, okay, I'm not busting on the custom guys, but, you know, the custom guys come in late and he doesn't have enough, you know, he doesn't have enough wagons or he doesn't have enough tractors. Okay, well, yeah, you don't control that. But technically, we have the most control at this critical point here, at the silo. And so if we know that we can do a pretty decent job bringing in high quality here, we got to make sure that we don't blow everything up inside the silo, okay? Now, So a lot of numbers here. I don't want to go through all of this because you've seen things like this, but I just want us to summarize again the fact that when we talk about losses within the silo, or in the harvesting process, I could put a couple other categories in here, but these are the main ones where you're probably going to lose some of your dry matter and your nutrients, okay? Respiration losses, this is why people are talking about wide swath, obviously, right? If you've seen some of the work out of Wisconsin where they've got alfalfa in the field, dried down for 1 day, followed by rain of about 1/2 inch to 1 inch, and then dried down again and harvested. Anybody know what the dry matter loss there is? It's in like the 25 to 35% range. So huge respiration losses because that plant's been sitting in the field and respiring and still alive. Fermentation losses, you go into the Clostridial fermentations or the ethanol type fermentations, you're going to have huge dry matter losses because those inefficient fermentations basically blow off what? Carbon dioxide. Carbon dioxide is a gas, goes up into the atmosphere, but where did the carbon come from? The carbon came from your nutrients, came from your dry matter, came from your protein, came from your starch, came from your sugars. So if you're blowing the C of the carbon dioxide out into the atmosphere, you're not saving it into your silo and feeding it to your cows and turning that carbon into milk, okay? Seepage losses, probably the bad example that I use all the time, the mycogen guys don't like this, but the worst case scenario for seepage loss is BMR silage going up too wet, being processed, and getting blown up in a tower silo, right? I mean, that could be like a worst case scenario for seepage problems because that crop's going to end up being just mushed to death in that tower silo after it's going through the blower, after it's being processed, and it's too wet. Storage, aerobic losses can be pretty high. We'll see some pictures of this, and you all know that, I travel from Idaho to Arizona down to Florida to New England every year, and it's amazing how many silos that I see where people still don't put plastic over their silos. I mean, where do you think the losses are at the end of the year? Huge. And so when you look at this, you read Horde's Dairyman or Dairy Herd Management or whatever you guys do out here, maybe Progressive Dairyman or something, most people are talking that the average loss within the silo is probably in that 10 to 12% range of dry matter, total dry matter. Even for good producers, you're probably not getting less than probably about 8 or 10%. And I'm going to tell you, if somebody says, oh, we did way in, way out, and I'm only losing 2%, it's not accurate. Nobody loses that little. Okay, it's just impossible. These guys are at least losing up in this range, 10 or 15%. And of course, the guys that are managing this poorly, obviously, are losing even more. So having said that, what is all that worth? And so you take somebody that's putting up 10,000 tons of silage a year, and you take 15%, and if your crop's 50%, $50 a ton, they just lost $75,000. Okay, and then you just put those numbers to wherever you want to be. And if you don't know how many tons you put up, just do it from an acre. I work with a lot of these small guys out east, and they don't know how many tons they put up, but they know how many acres they put in. So you say, okay, well, listen, if you planted 100 acres of corn and you only had 80 acres to feed, are you going to be happy at the end of the day? And of course, the answer is no, because there's a net loss of farm income there. So it's a significant amount of money. And obviously, I can't get you much below 10. But it's these guys that are up here that are at that 20 or 15 that if you follow some of the recommendations that we talk about today, we can probably get you down closer to this level and away from these higher levels up here, okay? And you guys know that there's some really big dairies out there that are putting up at, even more than that. And if you just do that math, I mean, it's a significant amount of money that these guys are leaving on the table. Plus, if you're up here, my guess is that you're probably going to have some losses in milk production too, right? That's going to be poor quality forage. So milk is going to drop. There's probably some toxins. And then when you go to your cardio guy or whoever's balancing your ration, because this material probably has lower nutritive value, your concentrate's going to be higher, okay? So that's the triple whammy. You lost dry matter, your cows produce less milk, and your ration's more expensive for you to feed, okay? All right. So the question there basically is, can you afford these kinds of losses? And I think, the answer obviously for everybody in here is basically no. So to start with high quality forage, Ev talked about the fact that they've been using a bunch of BMR at Minor, and we have too at the University of Delaware. I'm going to show you one of the first studies we did with BMR. back in the early 2000 age, 75-11 versus the BMR. Significant increase in dry matter intake, significant increase in milk production. Here's that 5 or 6 pounds that Ev talked about there, okay? Just show you some numbers. Here's a second study that was done, 75-11 against BMR. This BMR actually went up a little on the wet side, wetter than we would have liked to have put it up, but it was Friday, and the hurricane was coming on Monday. I mean, this was several years ago, but that hurricane was coming up the East Coast on Monday, and my farm crew looked at me and said, what are we going to do? And I said, what do you mean, what are we going to do? You're going to pull it in on Friday, even though it's a little wet, because if you pulled it in after the hurricane came through, you're going to have a problem. So it went up a little wet, but this is what it looks like. 33 versus 30, ADF here, ADL significantly lower, NDF 44, 43, starch a little lower because it's a little less mature. But here's the 30-hour NDFT that Ev talked about. Typical things that we have seen year after year with this, 52 to 64 or so. I mean, a huge difference in vitro NDFDs. And then here's the milk production. Now, I'm going to tell you that this study was very short periods in its experiment. So these were only 3 to 4 week periods. And actually, in that short period of time, we did not see an increase in intake because probably the periods were a little short. And actually, if you look at one of Bill Weiss's last studies with BMR2, where he had these short period Latin square type designs, he saw milk, but the intake wasn't there as well. And so the intake's probably going to lag a little bit. But in 3 weeks, we're seeing about a 4.5, 5 pound increase in milk production there. Fat-corrected milk's a little bit lower because our fat test is a little lower here. But these are pretty, relatively high-producing cows producing good milk. And, of course, feed efficiency goes up because milk is up and intake is not there. But, again, we've seen this year after year, just like Ev. I mean, Ev and I should just be like the poster boys here talking about this because we have seen on our farms what happens when we feed BMR. And the response is just consistent as all heck can be. So, having said that, Ev talked about this, where should you be for dry matters, and I certainly, for years, like Ev, have been telling people, you cannot put up corn silage that's too dry, and you do not want to put up corn silage too wet. And, I want to try to explain to you why is that. There is a consequence that you want to be someplace in this 35% dry matter range. And so here are the consequences that Ev touched on a little bit. Too early, starch content is low. These really wet silages undergo a very rapid fermentation so that the total acids at the end of fermentation are very high. They also usually have what we call a wild acetic fermentation. It is very, very common to see very wet corn silages to have very high acetics that are there because of these wild fermentations. And, of course, the runoff issue, especially if you're bagging or if you're going up into an upright. Too late, past 40%. The issue here is that the starch concentration is there, but the digestibility is probably pretty low, right? Because that kernel has now crystallized. So we got to have concentration of nutrients, but we want the digestibility to be there as well. This high dry matter silage also usually doesn't pack very well, and so we end up with some poor aerobic stability. And the question came about chopping. I'm going to tell you that if I get caught with really high dry matter corn silage, the thumb rules about particle size basically go out the window for me because I'm going to say, you know what, you pick your battle. And my battle is if I'm really, really dry, I'm going to chop that a little finer so that I get a good pack in the silo so it doesn't blow up in the silo on me. So I'm going to have short particles, but I'm going to have pretty decent fermentation. Okay? I'd rather deal with that battle than trying to say, oh, guess what? I need these really long particles, and so I'm going to chop it long, and it goes up dry, and then my whole silo burns down on me because everything didn't pack very well. So you got to pick your battles there. The bottom line here of too early, too late, however, is this, is that all these things end up with an effect on what? Reduced dry matter intake. And intake is what drives milk production for dairy cows. Remember that, right? How many people think that milk production drives intake? If you thought that, you're wrong. Intake drives milk production, okay? And cows are not like horses. What happens to a horse? You put poor quality forage in front of a horse. What does she do? She eats more. She can eat more, right? You do that in front of a cow, what happens? You stuff her rumen, and she can't eat more. And so that's a big problem. The horse is not a cow, so you cannot afford to feed that cow poor quality forage that's going to stuff the rumen. So here I borrowed this from Randy Shaver. You guys have probably seen this before, but here's whole plant dry matter, so maturity and starch digestibility in the whole tract of the cow. You know, cows are pretty efficient in digesting starch. The average is somewhere in this 95 to 97%. In unprocessed material, starch digestibility drops off because that kernel is less digestible. In processing, it still drops, but it doesn't drop off as fast. And so that's the big thing about processing, right? It's most effective when you're maybe a little bit on the drier side, probably someplace in here, you know, 30%. Processing is probably not going to help you because the kernel's not developed enough and you don't need to have it done. For those of you that haven't seen this, it's probably worth taking a couple shots, taking some samples in, going through the cornstarch processing score. All the big labs do this now. They'll take their sample, they'll dry it down, put it through a shaker thing, and somewhere there's a screen that's got 4.75 millimeter holes in it. Anything that passes through there or gets stuck on the screen, they analyze for starch. And so what happens is that if greater than 70% of the starch in your corn silage sample goes through the holes because they're small, right, then you're optimally processed. You're inadequately processed if 50% of the starch in your sample gets hung up on the hole, okay? And when you look at the databases from, the databases that I see are mostly from Dairyland out of Minnesota, Wisconsin. You know, of all the hundreds and thousands of samples that get sent in every year, it looks like probably 20% or so are optimum. There's about a good 40, 50% are average, and then there's about 30% that are less than average. I'm going to tell you that, you know, we really don't know how do we all need to be up here, because this database was created on a very small data set that Mertens put together years ago. But I do think that it's you know, safe to say that we want to try to get all these guys that are down here at least up into this range someplace, okay? Here's the limitation of that. If I'm sitting on the chopper and I want to figure out whether I got my rollers hunkered down enough, it's too late, because I got to send the sample in the field to the lab. It takes them a week to get me the analysis back. It doesn't help me. So the only thing you can do is to use some thumb rules, right? And the thumb rules have been out there for a long time. 95% of the kernels ought to be cracked or crushed. But I'm going to tell you that, you know, you can add a little caveat to that based on the processing score and say that, you know what, probably, you know, 60, 70% of the kernels ought to be less than a quarter kernel of a size. And the reason I say that is because a quarter kernel, on average, is going to go through that 4.75 millimeter screen, okay? So nicking and crushing is not enough. So I used to actually have this picture. This picture hasn't changed, but, you know, whatever, 8, 9 years ago when we first started to use corn silage processing, I used to take this picture and show everybody, says this is what we want because all the kernels are open. But I'm going to tell you that probably every single one of these kernels is probably going to get hung up on that screen, and so that's probably not processed enough, okay? The cob should be, you know, you shouldn't see a silver dollar cob. They should be probably in, you know, 6 to 8 pieces. Whole cob, not processed very well, okay? Okay, what else can you do? We do the bucket of water thing. You know, you get a bucket of water, you put a handful of your corn silage in, and you're panning for gold, right? All the husk, the cobs, all this stuff floats to the top. You put your hand, sort of screen some of this out, pour the water out at the bottom of the barrel. What do you have? Gold. And you can look at this and then say, hey, did I do a decent job? And, you know, yeah, you got some of these particles here that probably would not go through the screen. But I'm guessing that, you know, most of these, this is definitely adequately processed. And you might want to do that someday. You know, you might want to go take a sample, put it through the water test, take a digital picture of what's at the bottom, send it off to the forage lab. They're going to come back with a test, and then you can probably take a, you know, if you have a range of samples, you can have that on hand. And you probably won't have to send a sample into the forage lab for the processing score anymore. You know, Mertens and Taysom probably hate me for doing that, for telling you to do that, but, you know, that's what we do, okay? So, air, worst enemy of silage. And you guys have heard us say this for years and years and years. You know, at the front end of fermentation, it delays the process. It uses nutrients. And then at storage and feed out, it stimulates the growth of yeast that cause a problem and that initiates spoilage within the silo pile, okay? And of course, the bigger problem with this is that we have larger dairies with harvesting and storage challenges. We have larger silos. We have people that are packing too slow, and then we have people that are packing too fast. Poor storage, slow feed out, all these kinds of issues. Okay? So this is the domino effect of why air is such a bad thing on aerobic spoilage. So the first domino that falls is that silage exposed to air. If you got a lot of spoilage yeast, the yeast wake up, they degrade lactic acid, their numbers increase, highly degradable nutrients are destroyed. Of course, highly degradable nutrients are destroyed. I mean, it's too bad that these guys don't eat lignin, right? That would be great. You know, let's go have them target the lignin, but that doesn't happen. It's the soluble sugars that go first, the starch, the soluble protein. Heat's produced, the pH increases because the lactate is going up, and then the molds wake up, and you get this secondary spoilage that occurs. Okay? So I'm going to tell you that, you know, you need to tell your dairymen that anybody that sees mold, what's the issue? At some point, there was air. I mean, it's simple. Anytime you see mold, at some point that was air. There was air there. In a bag, even if it's a, you know, you've been going through a whole pile or a bunk, and all of a sudden there's this little section, all of a sudden there's these pockets of red mold or white mold. What does that tell you? Air. There was air trapped in that mass some time, and that's all it has to do with it. Because if you didn't have the first domino to fall, none of this would occur. Okay? So it is all about air. Okay. Problem with this bad silage, reductions in intake and low digestibility. So you're double whammied there. Cows eat less, and what they eat is less digestible, right? Bolson showed that in that work where he fed that crust layer to these steers. Steers ate less, and NDFD was less too. Big problems. Toxins, undesirable microorganisms. Guess what? Aspergillus fumigatus, right? The Prince guys talk about hemorrhagic bowel. What is Aspergillus fumigatus? It's a mold. Okay? So what does that mean? You would never have a mold unless you had what? Air. Okay. So rumen upsets, other metabolic effects, right? So we don't want to see this kind of stuff running around. Nobody likes to see that. It's just really bad news, okay? All right. And then, of course, when you see mushrooms growing into the pile, you know there's air, right? Obvious. Okay. So where do you start? Well, you got to group your forages, get your maybe group them by forage quality if you can. Not everybody can do that. Contingency plans for worst case scenarios. I mean, somebody should say, hey, if that crop is out there and it looks like a really good crop, but it gets rained on 3 times, should you really go put it on top of first cutting in the same bunk with high quality forage? Maybe it needs to go someplace else, okay? Or maybe it just needs to stay in the field. I don't know. Size your silos correctly. I mean, that's probably the big thing that everybody sees is these massive silos that have faces that are too big, and everybody's doing the cookie cutter thing, going up and down because they just can't keep up ahead of the air causing spoilage. So for silo filling, obviously we need to fill quickly, pack tightly, 14, 16 pounds of dry matter per cubic foot. If you can get it higher, that's better. 6 to 8 inch layers, minimize the mud from the tires, and heavy tractors. And I'm going to show you some things that it's all about tractor weight and time and passes. Okay? You got to have the tractors. They got to be heavy. They got to be crossing and passing. They can't be sitting on the side. True story. 2 years ago, we were in Wisconsin. I do a bunch of work up there for the Vita Plus folks, and we were at a farm, and they were trying to figure out why did this one pile have such poor density when the guy was there and he was supposed to be packing. So after about a half an hour, we figured out, and I swear, this is a true story, found out that the guy was packing. The stuff actually wasn't coming in too fast. It was coming in too slow. So he had his archery set on the side of the pile, and in between loads that were coming in, because they weren't coming in fast enough, he got off the tractor and was practicing and getting ready for bow season. Okay? So, you know, that's a big disconnect, right? I mean, you got the tractor sitting there, but it's not on the pile packing, okay? All right. So this packing is important because, as you can see, this is the classic Kurt Ruppel scenario. Dry matter losses are high when pack density is low, and it decreases with increasing density here. Bags will probably be here. And again, you know, the bags pack only because of the tunnel. You know, it's the tunnel that does the packing. So if you got guys that have old baggers that don't have a tunnel extension on them, they better put a tunnel extension on. Piles, bunks, you need to be up in this range someplace, okay? Can you get too high? I've seen, you know, a couple farms up in this 20, 22, but that's pretty rare. I think if you're in this range, 15, 16, you're probably going to be good, okay? Bunk cores are out there. You can get these from NASCO, I think. You can buy these from Dairy One. I'm going to tell you, though, that you need to be really careful if you're doing bunk cores. You notice I took the picture. I personally, no joke, do not walk up to silos that are this big. I don't care what they look like or whatever. I will not walk up and take a sample and go smell silage from that. I'll have somebody else go walk up to it, okay? Because it's really, really dangerous. These things cave in, and Steve and I have been on farms where, like, we basically walked away and, like, 10 seconds later, all you hear is the back there, and there's 20 tons of silage down there smoking that just fell where you were standing, okay? So watch out there. Pack tractors. Borrowed this from Brian Holmes. You got to have weight on them. They got to have good transmission so that they don't slip. Four-wheel drive. They need to have high pressures in the tires. Do whatever you need to do to get the traction so that these animals are crossing and getting the pack density done. You got to have thin layers too. And thin layers sometimes means that you may not be able to fill in, the classical progressive wedge. People have talked about you need the wedge to have the thick wedge in the back and go this way. But you know what? If you think about that in a 3-to-1 slope progressive wedge, and you have X amount of tons come in, your surface area on there is really, your run is really short compared to if you had a longer run. So that means that you're packing really thick layers on every load in a real short run over rise there. So maybe the progressive wedge is not necessarily the way to go if you want to get good density and pack in short layers. Push and pack partial loads, wider storage has implications for feed out rates, and obviously multiple tractors, and you need to do whatever you need to do to hang weight or fill your tires if you need to do it, but get some weight and make sure obviously that if you put weight on that you don't unbalance your tractor so that you take the weight off if you put too much weight on the front or in the back, you may actually take off the center of gravity on your packing wheels, okay? Cover with plastic and tires as soon as you can. White plastic is better than black. Thicker is better than narrow. 2 layers is better than 1. You may want to use these reusable tarps. I don't know if you guys went to Dairy Expo the last couple of years, the silo man or bag man or whatever. He was walking around with all these little green bags for groceries, but they were basically made out of this green mesh that's reusable. Work really well with critters, maybe not really well if you're feeding out in the winter and you have a lot of snowfall. But then what that means is that if you're in one of those conditions, then you just put that for the feed that you know is going to be fed in the summer where there's not going to be any snow, where the snow's gone. Plastic on the sidewalls, that's probably not an issue for you guys here because you guys probably don't have too many bunkers, but that's a real big thing out more in the Midwest and Northeast where we're probably way more bunkers than piles. But that helps us for keeping the water out of our sides. Here's a temperature of under the first 10 inches of black versus white plastic cover. So where do you want your silage to be? Do you want your silage heating up to be, and this was done in Mexico, so it's hot down there. But you know what? Do you want your silage in that top foot to be breathing and doing this 115 because of the ambient temperature and the sun just beating on it, or do you want it to be cooler? You want it to be cooler, right? So if you're using oxygen barrier plastic and you're feeding out your silo in the next 2 months, I'm not sure that you're really going to get a benefit out of that. But if that's that silage that you're saving, and it's like now 6, 7, 8, 9 months, 1 year later, maybe this is where this oxygen barrier plastic really is going to take hold and do something good for you. It's very thin. I'm going to tell you that there have been studies where we have done oxygen barrier plastic versus normal plastic, and you have to put another layer of something on top of this because either normal plastic or you have to put a tarp because it's too thin and there's no UV protection in this stuff, so it's always 2 layers. But what we've not done, and that I know of anybody's done, is no one's actually made the comparison. What happens if you just use 2 layers of normal plastic versus 1 layer of oxygen barrier and 1 layer of normal on top? We don't know. So someone needs to do that research, okay? No chia pet covers. I do not like chia pet covers. They do not work, okay? So you guys do this, the guy puts up his corn silage and then throws rye on and then expects that to protect his cover. Doesn't work very well, okay? Double plastic in tires, look at here. This guy's still forking off a foot of spoilage a day. So just because you got double plastic in tires doesn't necessarily mean that you've solved the problem, okay? So I want you guys to think about what was the problem here then, okay? We'll see that in a second. Push-up piles, the standard California pile, all these guys have problems because, all their sides are all spoiled because what? They don't have density. They don't, they're not running over that side. They're just pushing up one way and getting off. You're going to see probably in about 2 years or so, hopefully, this is not released in the U.S. yet, but they've got oxygen barrier plastic that has been tested for big bales, too. Here's some work out of Italy. This was just in the Journal of Dairy Science last month. 2, 4, 6 layers of polyethylene, dry matter losses. You can see the more layers, the less dry matter loss. Oxygen barrier plastic, the same thing. But look, 2 layers of oxygen barrier plastic had less dry matter loss than 8 layers of normal polyethylene in that study. Pretty impressive stuff, okay? Keep the air out. I mean, these guys obviously did a good job here. You recognize that, Steve? That's Idaho someplace. Steve probably knows what farm that's from. These guys are anal retentive about getting this stuff covered. And that's what you want to be when it comes down to protecting your crop, right? Keep the air out the seams, more weight on the edges, anything that you can do to keep the air from getting underneath the plastic. Because air does migrate underneath the plastic at those seams, right? Gravel bags have been out there. You can run around with these. They move around real light. They're about 50 pounds, 55 pounds. You got to put pea gravel in them. You do not want to fill them with sand because sand will hold water, and the sand with water freezes. And that is bad news. So pea gravel works really well. You can line the edges. Here's protective tarp, silo stop underneath, gravel bags, and believe me, because we packed 3 of these silos in about 4 days at the University of Penn one year, and believe me, it was a lot more fun and a lot cleaner to do this than it was to do that, okay? Because you just, you have got this perimeter here, real nice with the protective tarp. I'm going to tell you that one of the things that we see is this watch out for the management disconnect, plastic and tires, but what's the disconnect here? Not enough tires, plastic pulled back too far in advance. Okay. Now, if it's minus 30 degrees outside, you can pull your plastic back for 2 weeks in advance. It's probably okay. But when the weather's warm, that's a big problem because it's air, right? Air causes those dominoes. Holy holes, Batman, the disconnect. Hey, why do you put stuff in a bag? Because you want to keep the air out. So if you're not checking your bags and checking for the holes, that's the disconnect, right? And I can tell you that from here to here is probably all garbage in that bag, complete garbage, okay? We put up a lot of bags on our farm, and I'll tell you, we can find holes about right now because we actually just found one in one of our bags at our beef farm. The hole was smaller than the size of a pencil eraser, okay? And the section of bag that we had to throw away was about 8 feet like this, and it went all the way to the other side of the 9-foot bag with a hole that was the size of a pencil eraser, okay? All right, here's one problem that I see with using only 1 layer of plastic and using only gravel bags at the perimeter. This is actually from a research study that we did several years ago, and we had critters in here, okay? Well, you know what? Unfortunately, we were only going up on the silo about once every 2 weeks to check for holes. But look what happened here. I've got perimeter here and no tires here, and I'm thinking, well, I just saved myself a bunch of labor. But what? I got holes here, and guess what? All of this here is now exposed to air because air is getting underneath that mass. So I sort of personally, because I've been burned with this, don't like people saying, let's just use this on the perimeters. I still would probably put splits in here. I probably wouldn't put holes, tires, because I can get away with splits here, but I would still put splits here because of this potential critter damage. Okay? Here's some practical management ideas for tires and things from farms that I've been on over the years. This is a farm that built these nice steel prongs here to manage all their splits when they weren't using them so that they're just not thrown every place. They've also got a little contraption here they built that hooks up to the front of the tractor so that they can pull out their rolls of normal plastic, pull out the roll of silo stop, because those rolls just weigh an incredible amount. And this just hooks up to the front. They run up there, and that thing just rolls right out. Man, it just works just really, really nice. Okay? So now that we see that we put stuff into the silo, we've got to figure out what happens here. We say, well, how far back from the face does air move? And the work from Muck basically shows that even in a silo that has 15 pounds of dry matter per cubic foot, okay, even there, what happens? 3 feet that air moves back in. 3 feet. Wow, that's a lot. So that means if you're taking out 6 inches a day, that means that silage has seen air for about a week before the cow actually eats it. So the dominoes are falling a week before your cows see it. Now again, in cold weather, it probably doesn't matter very much. In warm weather, it can make a difference. And so you got to manage the face of the silo. I don't know what the minimum number is. There is no minimum number for me because it just depends on how hot is it, how tightly are you packed, you know, what are you removing per day. But you got to remove more in hot weather and in drier silages to get past the dominoes from falling. Okay? Keep the face clean, minimize the face damage, and knock down only enough feed to feed for that day. You need to keep the plastic down at the feeding edge. You can use stacked, you know, the stacked nickel thing up here until your feeder gets really mad at you because it's a real pain in the you know what to get these all moved. That's why gravel bags work really well at that feeding edge because then it doesn't allow air to get underneath the mass, and it's real easy to push these back every day or every 2 days. Okay? But do something at the seams and at the feeding edge, the leading edge of the feeding face. Okay? All right. Manage the silo face. This may not be possible every place, but it could be something about you might think about when you're expanding, is to maybe keep that silo face away from the afternoon sun, right? Because especially in really hot climates, the afternoon sun is the beating sun, right? And it's going to be beaten on that face versus if that face were away from the sun and not facing west either, because west, you know, you got the problem with all the prevailing winds and the water coming in, but maybe you can get away with keeping your face cooler, especially in warmer weather. And then the face shavers, you know, everybody's got a different type of face shaver. I can't tell you how many different types of face shavers I've seen. Most useful when your density is low and if your feed out rate is slow. Okay, the work from Brian Holmes shows maybe in this type of situation, maybe if you're only removing 3 inches a day and you've got a bunker density of maybe only about 12 pounds of dry matter cubic foot, maybe you're saving 3% dry matter in those situations. But if your bunk density is 18 and you're taking off 12 inches a day, there's no guarantee that the face shaver is probably going to save you anything. And then probably the biggest downside on the face shavers is this, is that it does take longer time to feed. And if you have to calculate that in, I've seen Brian's actually spreadsheets on that. That's the biggest unknown on return on investment on the face shaver is that the cost of time that it's going to take somebody to take that stuff down. Is that paying back for that wage? Okay, if you're going to use the face shavers, you got to use them properly. I mean, if the guy's doing the cookie cutter like this and then using the face shaver in the front, disconnect, right? What are you saving here if you're managing your silo like this or like this? Okay? Feeding considerations, all these things need to cure. 4 to 6 weeks, 3 to 4 months better. Make gradual feed changes to new silage. Here's some work out of Nebraska. 30% moisture, high moisture corn, 24% versus dry shelled. And they're looking at dry matter digestibility, and you can see that over time, there's this phenomena where we see that the longer this material is in the siler, the more digestible it gets. Probably because of the acid working on the starch, the acid working on the hemicellulose. And in fact, this was presented last summer at ADSA. This is out of Wisconsin. Market increase in NDFD, not starch, NDFD with corn silage over time. Okay, so just something to think about. There's probably 2 more other publications that I can show you that have shown very similar phenomena. So I think this is real, what we're seeing in the field. Okay, real quick on inoculants. Consider only after you've done everything possible to improve harvest and storage management. So the inoculants, if you got the guy using the chia pet cover, you didn't even talk about inoculants, okay? Because that's not what they need to fix first. They need to fix all the other stuff first. But the approaches for using inoculants are pretty simple. And I'm going to try to make this real simple for you based on what Rich Muck says. Rich says there's really 3 issues here. 1, prevent a Clostridial fermentation. 2, improve aerobic stability. 3, make a good fermentation better. Wow, that's pretty simple, okay? Pretty simple. Target the wet alfalfa and grasses. You want that low pH. Improve aerobic stability in your high moisture corn and corn silage if you need it. Use the Buchnerei type products. And make a good fermentation better by improving dry matter recovery, okay? Calibrate your applicators, distribute evenly. This doesn't work very well. These guys don't, they don't have little wings, they don't crawl, they don't do the backstroke through the silo. Wherever you put it, that's where they are. Liquid is better than dry. Also going to tell you is, guess what? You need to take a look at how hot your liquid is in your inoculant tank. Here's 4 scenarios. Water in the tank, 86 degrees, 86 degrees, 95, 86, 102, 86, 113, 86. So we just figured, okay, the guy's up there chopping for 6 hours, and let's just say something breaks, and they got to bring the thing in. But the temperature, 86 and 95, there's not much of a drop in these inoculants in the CFU count in the tank. But when we get up to 100 degrees, some of these inoculants are really dropping. And by 113, they're just dropping like flies. And you don't have to be here to have a problem. If this is dropped in 3 hours, okay, right here, that's about 3 hours, that drop is enough to make your inoculant not effective at all, period. You might as well just been on the silage, okay? So the bottom line here, keep your water in your tanks below 95 degrees Fahrenheit. You know, for probably 99% of you, your water probably never gets that hot. But I'm going to tell you, especially out west here in Arizona, California, and maybe Idaho, where you're harvesting some of this stuff and it's like, 100 degrees, 110 outside, you may want to just check, your water in your tank one of these days. And don't check it in the morning, You need to check it, in the heat of the battle, like a couple hours after the guy's out there chopping and see how hot that is, okay? Microbial inoculation, this is the last thing I think I've got here, is can it improve NDFD? Because we've seen that in the field, right? There's several new inoculants on the field, and there's one specifically, the 11 CFT inoculant, that's been running around saying that we improve fiber digestibility. That bug breaks this bond here. It actually produces this ferulic acid esterase enzyme, takes off lignin from the hemicellulose molecule, so technically should improve fiber digestibility. Here's some work. This actually just got published in JDS this year too, from Florida. 2 hybrids, NDFD, untreated, treated, untreated, treated. Did not work here, worked here. Unfortunately, aerobic stability was better here, but it was worse here. Ouch. I don't know if I can give that up. So little weird results there. This is work from our shop. 2 Pioneer hybrids, BMR, inside for 60, 180, or 360 days, okay? Control or 11 CFT. You can see here that there's a little bit of an improvement here and here and here, but none of this is statistically different. No improvement all the way here until 360 days in the silo. Then I get a statistical improvement and never an effect on the BMR, okay? So again, very inconsistent results. I'm not sure that I have the capacity to wait 1 year to put silage up for 1 year before I can get a 5-unit increase. The other take-home is just like what Ev was talking about, the consistent differences you see between a BMR hybrid and a non-BMR hybrid. Here's a 10 to 12 point difference there across those hybrids. Here's another study that we just finished. Actually, this has 2 varieties and 4 maturities. So and they're all buried in here because there was no interaction between the maturities and everything. But here's NDFD with untreated silages, LBC, which is the Limin Buchnerei combo, and then the 11 CFT. No difference in NDFD across the board. Doesn't matter whether we put it up at 28% dry matter, doesn't matter whether we put it up 33, 38, or 42.